Good evening, gentlemen. It's a great pleasure talking to you again. I'm going to talk today on something which is almost antique, and we are going to discuss how Russia has always been the enemy which America considers ever since 1945. When the Second War came to an end, Stalin was the man who was leading Russia, and at that time, Roosevelt had died and Truman had taken over. So the situation at that time was pretty bad, in the sense that the Soviet Union, which had been formed, was totally anti-capitalist against America, and Stalin was keen to extend his hegemony, and he did by gobbling up the entire Eastern Europe, and he also gave arms to Mao Zedong, with the result that the Red Army won in China, and Chiang Kai-shek, the American ally, fled the country. So it started from that side. In 1948, Stalin enforced what we know as the blockade of Berlin. It was to put pressure on the Americans, but that time Truman organized an airlift to Berlin, and the situation was retrieved. Then came the Korean War, which was the first shadow boxing between the Americans and the Russians, and I would say it was a draw. The Americans couldn't beat the North Koreans, mainly because the Chinese who intervened in North Korea. So this history of this thing continued, and animosity was built up between the USSR, the successor state to Russia, and the Americans. It's worth pointing out now that General Eisenhower, who was the president of the USA from 1952 to 60, launched a number of military pacts with an idea to encircle the Soviet Union. He had military pacts with Japan, with South Korea, then he had the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, and then he had the Baghdad Pact. Now, the Baghdad Pact came a cropper when the King Faisal of Iraq was shot dead in a coup d'etat, and the Prime Minister Nouri al-Said was lynched by the crowd. And so the Americans had to shift the headquarters, and they began to call this organization CENTO. So this continued. They had an alliance with Turkey, and then they positioned nuclear weapons in Turkey and Germany. Then something unique happened, and I think the only person to blame for it is the communist regime and the communist philosophy which had spread in Russia. This was a philosophy which was a utopian dream, and all it said was utopia, and the Russian economy tanked. It was not a realistic policy, and what actually happened then was that there was a complete collapse of the Soviet Union, and there was no leader after Stalin and Khrushchev, and to an extent Brezhnev, who could hold that mighty country together, and it fragmented into 22 countries. Probably at that time, the Americans thought they had won the Cold War, and I remember reading at that time a statement by Margaret Thatcher, the British Prime Minister. She said, "Communism is finished." She was right. Communism was finished. And the successor state was Russia, and the Russians were bewildered because at that time they had been a global power, and now they had become third-rate power. Their nuclear submarines were rotting in the Arctic. They didn't know what to do. And at that time, America should have taken the leadership of the world and incorporated Russia into their arena. They didn't do that. In fact, in 1992, Boris Yeltsin, the then president of Russia, the successor state to the USSR, had made a request to join NATO. Now, this is very significant, gentlemen. At that time, Bill Clinton was the president. He decided he didn't want Russia in this organization, basically because the American military tank was of the view, think tank was of the view that We need an enemy, a raison d'etre in Europe, someone whom we can call as an enemy so that we can rouse the small European states together, create a fear psychosis, and then we will have our hegemony over Europe for all time to come. So they rejected the Russian request and at the same time made an assurance to the Russians that we will not expand NATO eastwards to the Warsaw Pact countries or to countries on the border of Russia. This was blatantly disregarded, but as Russia was weak, Russia could do a thing. The NATO expanded to the borders of Russia, and those small countries on the Baltic, like Latvia, Estonia, Poland, all of them became members of NATO. Now, people at that time were wondering, what is the purpose of NATO? NATO is basically a paper tiger. That is my view. And it's an obsolete organization because it cannot fight any war. And they have not fought a war for the last 78 years. How efficient they are in actual battle will have to be only seen when they fight. So what actually happened was at that time, NATO was kept as an umbrella by the Americans, basically to keep all the countries together with a lollipop that if something happens, we'll come and to your side, we'll save you. And save against whom? They had created the enemy, that is Russia. So obviously, it was the American plan to create Russia as an enemy. And they were successful because Russia was weak at that time. But then came Vladimir Putin. I will say he is not a man in the class of Joseph Stalin, but he had some good qualities and he wanted to make Russia once more the power it was during the days of the Tsar. And he objected to Ukraine being made a frontline state against Russia. Now, this is one of the facts of history, or I would say irony of history, that Boris Yeltsin, after he left, handed over power to Vladimir Putin. And in Ukraine, we had a man who was a novice, who was basically a stage actor who became the president, and he was Zelensky. Zelensky played into the hands of the Americans, and he thought he would be the knight in shining armor and battle the Russians and destroy them. And the Americans were pretty confident that they would not only bolster the confidence of these East European countries, but also help further fragment Russia into few more small countries so that forever Russia is finished. That was the American plan. But it failed basically because of one man who stood firm, and he was Vladimir Putin. So what was to happen has happened. Putin objected to Ukraine becoming a frontline state against Russia because it was creating a crisis of existence for Russia. And he launched the military operation, which he termed it as a limited military operation in Ukraine. Now, we know what all happened. I won't discuss that. I just want to bring out the fact that from 92, it was the American plan to entice Russia, at the same time create a bogey of Russia in Europe. I think Donald Trump was very correct, the former president, when he said that NATO is an obsolete organization. And it has proved to be obsolete because despite all the help being given to Ukraine, Ukraine hasn't made any headway. They have lost 25% of their territory, and they're destroyed. I think the writing is on the wall for the small Baltic states, Poland and the small countries going around, that in case there is a nuclear exchange, these countries will cease to exist. So, the old saying that it's better to be circumspect and fools move in where angels fear to tread is true. The Americans have put themselves in a bind, and I do not know how they are going to get out of it. Gentlemen, I close now, and I wish you all the best. Do subscribe to my channel, share it with your friends, and I'll say goodbye and Jai Hind. God bless you all.